efficiencies better so that we can remove them from the equation, invest to make them less effective. In fact, the weaknesses of our SWOT analysis are sort of it's one of the weird categories, because a weakness that you identify as a strategic deficiency is one that is either not relevant enough to your strategy, and so you're not fixing it, in which case, why is it a strategic weakness? Or it's one that you're actively pursuing to fix because it would represent a strategic opportunity. And so the differences between weaknesses and opportunities is incredibly blurred in ways that is not intuitive. The differences between strengths and threats are blurred. And again, you think it's the opposite, right? You think strengths are opportunities. No, that's the easy story. That's the first story we learn. Strengths tell us about our threats because the assumption is that those strengths remain relevant as the industry threats emerge. And so if the threats that we recognize are the most relevant when they directly relate to the capabilities we currently get from our strengths. And so finding ways to analyze our capabilities that simultaneously consider where we are and where we are headed is a skill that requires a deep understanding of your organization. But then when we do that, when we engage that, when we do that data collection, the firms that are able to capture that have significant benefits, have significant advantages over their rivals. And so the strength of the capabilities analysis is twofold. We both want to have an understanding of our capabilities so that we can pursue opportunities more effectively. But we also want to be really good at knowing what our capabilities are, so that we can act faster than our rivals, so that we are making more informed decisions than our rivals. Enter the resource-based view, right? The way that we articulate that discussion, the way that we think about that, is by applying an entirely separate theory of the firm. So a theory of the firm is a really sort of fancy way of saying a way that we define organizations. So, right, the first question of business, right, is why don't people just go to the market with their individual competencies? Why do we bundle together under organizations, right? Why not just have an open market of skills? Well, it's inefficient because it doesn't work that well. Because when you try to do that, the individuals that are able to organize more effectively are going to outcompete you. And it's not going to matter about your individual skills if you're not able to find a good context for them. And so a resource-based view of the firm is not just a tool that we use. It's an honest to goodness, a frame of definition. We define a firm as a bundle of resources when contemplating strategic opportunities. Not as people, not as the diversity of things that organizations are, but as a bundle of resources and the capabilities that they illustrate. Because if we can think about organizations as its resources, then we can start to think, well, what resources are necessary, what are redundant, what are obsolete, what are going to become more redundant, become more important in the future, what are going to become less important in the future. So we can start looking at our organization less as an individual business. This is particularly relevant as we move from business strategy topics to corporate strategy topics to portfolio topics. If we could think of our organization less as a business or as a bundle of businesses and markets, right? For our internal analyses, if we can look at it as a series of capabilities and moving away from the transactional approach of strategy, which we can also forget. We're doing both of these at the same time. Welcome to my world. But by looking at resources as they reflect the capabilities of the firm. And so you'll hear the resource-based view language a lot. It's why we call it human capital, human resources, right? It's because that's the different. Capital and resources are synonymous in many contexts, but it's really whether we're looking at it from a capabilities perspective, financial perspective, and from a strategic opportunity approach, capabilities are necessary. The analyses that we went through in the chapter and that was talked about in the discussion of RIO and the SWOT are similar to the Porter's 5 forces that we talked about last week, in that they are deceptively simple, and because of that, are easy not to use very well. Because because they're accessible, because we can mold them to fit a lot of different questions. They're easy to fit questions that they don't actually answer. And so like everything else, the tools that we're talking about are much more, it's much more important to know when to, or it's just as important to know when to use these tools than it is how to use them. And by using that terminology, so that we use those resources in our resource analysis, so that same perspective, what is valuable, rare, and immutable, and organizable about a resource, right? Strong resources, weak resources, opportunities relevant to our capabilities. So this resource-based view permeates our entire discussion. But it's important that we understand that we're talking about resources as a basis of differences, right? So if we think about the really general cliche, how a firm strategy is different, what is the source of strategic heterogeneity? Well, there's three things. There's goals, there's resources, and there's capabilities. And again, with me, resources and capabilities are the difference. But if you have different goals, you're going to have a different strategy. If you have different resources, you're going to have a different strategy. Those are the internal factors that change, right? And governance is another one. If you have, depending on how you govern the goals, goals, governance, and resources. So, from that understanding, we can then understand both the opportunities and the risks of this sort of internal analysis. One of the assumptions that we make in doing this is that resources are heterogeneous across rivals. That's a fairly safe assumption. I know that last week we talked about cluster effects and isomorphism, and that is true. In oligarchic settings, these analyses become less relevant. They assume a degree of healthy competition, right? This whole class is assuming we're in a competitive field. This is not a class for oligarchic strategies, although we'll be using that again as examples of it now and again. And so the resource heterogeneity is a fairly safe assumption. It also assumes that your resources are yours this year are going to be the same resources you have access to next year. That's not a safe assumption. Resources are not particularly immobile. And so that's one of the assumptions that we need to control for in our resource-based view, in our internal analyses, is the likelihood of these resource strengths, of us losing them, of those being outsourced or those being taken away, or us losing access to these capabilities. These models are not great at telling us that. Those are separate questions. And so we do have those assumptions in these models. But we can actually start to see that in a variety of ways. We can start to see that in PAPSIM. We can start to see that in terms of who's going to have access to leadership, who's going to be the leader of different industries. We go to your production analysis page in the capstone career. We know after 1 week who's your price leader, who's your cost leader, who's your value leader. We know that in every segment. It doesn't even take us a hard time to see it. Who has the lowest price in that segment? Is that important for that segment? Maybe, maybe not. That's what we're asking. Who has the lowest unit cost in that segment? Who has the highest difference between them? It's the value leader, right? Who's generating the most return for the least cost? Those tell you a lot about what success looks like in that segment. If you don't know why one company performed in a way different than you, go to those production analyses. See that and say, wait, our price was the same? Our marketing budget was the same? Why is their earnings per share so much higher? There's a reason. I guarantee you, there's a reason. And the reason is our resources that team invested in. Maybe it was automation in the low-end and traditional segment. Good segments to invest in automation. That leads to capabilities that lower those labor costs, right? Those are actual. So finding the way that we can see how these distinctive capabilities emerge, using the CAPSIM as a type of backdrop, as a context for understanding that, gives us this sort of logic, but it requires us to go. It requires us to understand sort of where we're going in the past simultaneously as for the future, and it also requires us to assume that we are driven towards value creation as a means of competitive advantage. Again, a safe assumption in stable industry. In your CAPSIM industry, it is a necessary assumption. For your founder-led entrepreneurial firm, probably not, less so. So keep these in mind. Creating value creation doesn't look the same for every firm in every industry. It is the goal. It certainly is the goal for every firm in every industry, but that's because it's a general term. And so because you are direct rivals with each other, you're able to measure your performance directly. But that's an industry, it's a contextual benefit. That's an asset because of the fact that you're direct rivals. It doesn't actually give us the theory that underlies our strategic thinking. When we think about value creation versus competitive advantage, two of the primary outcomes of our internal analysis. Your value creation is entirely internal, right? We think about value creation through our business modeling and through internal processes. Your competitive advantage is sort of how we articulate that value creation as relevant in a competitive context. But it's the same idea, right? If your competitive advantage is in low cost, is in your cost leadership, if that's a driver of your competitive advantage, then the value you're creating is an economic value in your costs. There is a value creation tied to that competitive advantage. If the competitive advantage is in market value creation, so that you can create a product for X amount of money and be able to sell it for a lot more than that, you created some economic value, right? Certainly. Right? But so understanding where value creation comes in gives us the idea of what, if we think about the goal that was used in the model of the book, the superior firm performance is the outcome of a competitive advantage, direct, linear outcome, right? That's fine because firm performance can mean a billion different things, and that's true. It's not a competitive advantage if you don't lead to that performance, but it's the same reason why that makes so much sense on the foreground. We have to go back as well into our organization and say if value creation makes sense at the industry level through competitive advantage, we have to see it at the organizational level too, because as we learned from last week, we're a rival. We're our industry. Our industry does not exist separate from us. So when we're talking about a competitive advantage, driving value creation, linking that to our internal capabilities is necessary. The differences, though, can be, the difference in perspective is a radical shift from industry to organizational, but the difference in function isn't there at all. The difference in the phenomenon that we're studying, the difference in how we can articulate value creation shouldn't be different. In fact, if it is, it would be really odd because we form a path dependence in our investments. We talk about them 8 different stocks, and we're going to continue to do that. And if you stay in strategy, it's going to continue to happen, where we talk about the same thing from so many different parts of how it occurs, so that we can understand how to tweak it. And that path dependence is real. Our core competencies are not accidents. Right? Our core strengths do not exist at random. We don't start a company and then say, okay, now what are our strengths? Right? That's weird. We don't see an opportunity and say, well, I wonder if we can do that. Well, it's not much of an opportunity if you don't know what you can do or not. How can you tell if anything's an opportunity if you don't know your capabilities? What's an opportunity if it's an opportunity for your rivals and not for you? Sounds more like a threat. And so understanding that path dependence, seeing that where we can ingrain linearity and where we need to disrupt that linearity is where the value creation aspect of internal analysis comes in. When we talk about it in the book, when we talk about it in the lecture, and even when I talk about it in terms of since I'm an analyst and not a strategist, me professionally, this is my job. The analysis itself is valuable to me, but in an organization, it's valuable when it drives tactic selection. It's valuable when you say, "Oh, those are our capabilities," and then instead of leveraging them into your leveraging them towards a competitive advantage that leads to that superior performance. If those acts, there is no other way to get to that outcome, to superior firm performance, because we're not talking about a next step. We're talking about nested phenomena. What works at the business level, works at the organizational level, works at the corporate level, works at the industry level. If it doesn't, then we messed up somewhere. If the value creation you're doing in your individual businesses doesn't help the value creation in your broad industry, in your competitive advantage, then what's the value being created? Then what are we talking about? And so finding those links, finding is not about doing the same test over and over and over. It's making sure that we understand that our organization doesn't just exist as an industry. It doesn't just exist at a corporate level. Every one of those stages of that hierarchy that we talked in the first day is its own independent set of rules. It's its own independent set of needs, of demands. And our job in understanding the path of value creation, of internal analysis, of core competency, all the way to competitive advantage, comes from our mastery over the dynamics, not over the resources, over the exchange. Okay, so that might sound like, as we're going through this, and this is so as you're going through the book, and if this happens, you're among friends. This was a major hurdle for me as I was trying to take a classroom knowledge and apply this in any sort of meaningful way to business communities, right? Strategic success is not precise. All of these analyses that we're talking about in terms of value creation, if it sounds like we're talking very loosely, if it sounds like I'm explaining this in fuzzy ways, I am. It isn't precise. We don't get precise outcomes. Look at the CAPSTEM outcomes. Look at how accurate the most accurate forecasts were. They weren't perfect. Precision is not what we're looking for in strategy. It's not what you're looking for at the CAPSTEM. It's more about ranges. You're interested in what part of the range that we're in. We're interested in our cluster effects. We're interested in relational outcomes. And so precise outcomes don't get us very far. And we know they don't because we're not actually interested in strict capabilities. We're interested in dynamic capabilities. This is true for your professional life. This is true for organizations. Having static capabilities is fine, but they're not what drive performance. Having a static capability is fine, and it might get you to a place, it might open a door, it might get you to a level. But it's not how you grow. We don't grow from just being good enough once. We grow from continually reinvesting into our capabilities as individual professionals, like you're doing in your graduate studies, all the way up to our broad multinational organizations. We need to think about the way that we are pursuing our goals, and so that we can manage our organizations strategically. That's not an easy thing to do. Just as it's turned out every time we've talked about something really simple, it's turned into something very complex every time we go into greater detail. Welcome to strategy. When we think about what we're actually asking strategists of organizations to think about, when we say, what does it mean to be good at strategy? It means that we can't just understand these capabilities. We need to understand how we got them, how we're continuing to improve them. We can't just pursue competitive advantages. We need to pursue advantages that are not only relevant among our rivals, but that continue to drive market value creation, that fit with our capability investments, and that compound with the investments of our other investment strategies. Otherwise, we're not necessarily going to outcompete our rivals. Right? We need to be able to do all that, knowing full well that at the next industry pivot, the relevance of those investments may become deficient. And we may be actually investing in these capabilities. When you're investing in your low-end plants, and if 5 out of the 6 teams in the industry put the majority of their retained earnings into the same capability, it's no longer a strength. It just isn't. Now the team that you're going to have to find different ways to compete. You still have assets. You still have lower costs. And good luck trying to compete in that market without those. Now that it's the norm, now that it's everyone has that, but it's not. But it doesn't. It's no longer a strength if it's not relevant to the. If it's not sustainably relevant to your competitors. That automation, that 10 rating of automation in your low-end plant is no longer relevant if it's not unique in the system. If it's not unique in the industry. So hopefully we're starting to see that this is sort of the conclusion of I'm cashing the check that we wrote the very first day. When I said strategy isn't about individual plans, it's about a complex, dynamic industry, competitive context, and a dynamic organizational context, and finding how these two independent, dynamic systems overlap in ways that lead to unique opportunities and capabilities. It's not just plans driving performance. That is a definition, but the idea that those plans can drive performance means that we put a lot of thought into them. Means that we know what performance is, means that we know our capabilities, means that we know our organization, because without any of that, our plans suck. And we know that because we've been in those organizations. We know that because all we need to do is take a survey around this class, and I'm sure we'll find plenty of examples of plans that sounded fine applied in an organization where they didn't fit. And they were a waste of time. And maybe they were a waste of time at the frontline level, and maybe they were a waste of time at the executive level, and everywhere in between. And we bring in strategy consultants that do culture audits for assuming that you want to be Google. And the answer is, well, I guess we should have more ping pong tables, without wondering if that's actually instrumental to what you're trying to accomplish. Is it the ping pong tables that make Google Google? Probably not. That's probably not the biggest indicator. And so finding out how we can use these plans to inform our capabilities, not for now, but because they're powerful capabilities that we can leverage for the future, because they add to the resilience of our organization. They add value to our organization. They enhance our value chain. That's the goal of internal resource analysis. It's not descriptive. It's predictive. It tells us what to do. We do not induce our capabilities. We deduce our capabilities from our analysis. How are we feeling on dynamic capabilities? That is a pretty big part of what we're talking about. And even though this is the first chapter we talked about it, we've been talking about it all along. So hopefully it wasn't a surprise. Okay, so now that we have sort of an idea of that, let's look at the model that was given in your book that we talked a little bit about in the narration, because this is a cool model of thinking of sort of illustrating a lot of what we've talked about. I'm going to try recording again and see if things are fixed. As we look at this model, we can sort of see core competencies taking over as the combination of resources and capabilities. Again, the reason for that is semantic. Reinforcing resources and orchestrating capabilities is semantic. The differences are behavior. Recording cannot be started. Shoot. So the idea of your core competencies really are your strengths, right? The core competencies in this model and the strengths in your SWOT analysis, I don't know the difference. I don't know. I mean, it says resources up above and capabilities down below, but those are your competitive strengths. Those are what I would call a resource strength. Resource strengths are what we leverage to determine our activities. The activities are what our next 5 chapters of this class are going to be about. Right? The activities that we talk about are going to be the business modeling and the tactics and the mergers and acquisitions and diversification and integration. Right? Those are cool. I'm excited to talk about those. But those are only relevant when we leverage our core competencies towards them. We only pursue activities that we are strong at pursuing. We don't leverage activities that we're bad at, or else we get better at them before we do that. Right? We want to accomplish goals. We want to pursue our goals that we can accomplish. We don't drive our organization as, if you can be David and beat Goliath as a business, awesome, cool, that's a great strategy. Most of the time, 9 times out of 10, right? If I was going to bet on that fight, if I was an industry analyst and I was an investor and I only had finite funds to invest in, right? Goliath gets more investors. There's just a higher market cap there. There's more opportunity to do stuff. There's more resources. There's more assets. It doesn't protect you from everything. It doesn't stop a pivot. It doesn't stop disruption. But it makes sure that we're pursuing activities that we're good at pursuing. And it lets us grow. That growth, by pursuing activities that we're good at pursuing, by accomplishing problems that are best accomplished through alliancing, and accomplishing problems that are best pursued through internal R&D, we are going to gain a competitive advantage. Not because it leads to that, but because that's the nested effect. That's what this performance looks like at the industry level. I'm doing this to the folks in class. If you're on the screen, your core competencies, that very first one, that's already performance. Or else it's not a core competency. You're already good at doing that. It's already a relevant strength. And so the activities that we perform are just good decisions, are just the right activities. So it's not that it's the same planning, it's the same decision making. This looks like a linear process. but it's just a nested process. Think of this more as nested circles in each other than in one straight line. You develop your core competencies, which allow you to pursue better activities, which lead to competitive advantages, which are manifest through superior performance, which then leads to excess returns that you can reinvest back into your resource strengths, or into tomorrow's resource strengths, or to acquire a firm and a business that has benefits from your current capabilities, whatever those opportunities look like. How are we feeling? So there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on here. And internal resource analysis is the touchstone. It caps off what we've talking about very well. Better, in my opinion, than competitive advantage, which is technically the next chapter. But I think your internal resource analysis actually gives us the ammunition. It actually gives us the tools we need to fit these pieces together. Competitive advantage chapter is like the picture on the puzzle box. You know, we know what we're looking for. We know what we're supposed to look like. We've decided what this puzzle looks like. The external analysis is sitting at that frame. Now we've got to mesh it all together. Now it's about that. Now there's an expertise involved. Now there's vocation. Now there's craftsmanship. Now there's artistry. So this is where strategy becomes this, and it's where I become less relevant. It's where your analyst becomes less relevant. I can come up with measures for you. I can come up with models for you, right? But you don't want someone outside your firm not telling you what your capabilities are. Okay, moving on. So, we have a thorough, in-depth understanding of the nested nature of our competencies through advantage. And I clicked off. So let's actually talk about the analyses that we use to get there. The biggest one in this chapter was your SWOT analysis: strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats. Just like your Porter's 5 forces, I assume many of you, all of you, have seen this, hopefully a bunch of times. Your SWOT analysis is such a cliche part of business school education that it shows up in everywhere. It shows up in popular culture. It shows up in classes that aren't strategy classes all the time. And like a lot of strategy topics that show up in strategy class, that show up outside of the strategy classroom, it's oftentimes explained very, very poorly. Your SWOT analysis is, so the Porter's 5, I like talking about the Porter's 5 forces because oftentimes people have, if you just think about it from a textbook and you read it and say, well, that's not very useful. And so when we talk about Porter's 5 forces in practice, people see it. All of a sudden, oh, that's why it's relevant. It's the exact opposite problem with SWOT analysis. We know that the SWOT analysis is relevant. Anyone who's seen the SWOT analysis is like, oh, that's a good way to think about that. It's so clearly relevant that it's and so easy to use that it's very easy to oversimplify. It can be used in a lot of ways that don't fit the tools that we're going to be talking about now. And so one of the ways that, and I don't want to, so I guess one of the ways to do this, I'm not actually, I have no chip on my shoulder, but like you see this in marketing a lot, and it's applied in a way that it's applied in a way at the product level where we actually are, in my mind, taking away the analysis part of it. So a SWOT analysis is an actual analysis. It's something that we have. It's something that we have to think through. It's not something that's obvious. It's not something that is PR. It's not something that we use for marketing purposes. It's not even really product centric. It's a capabilities approach, and it is analyzed through deductive logics. The reason why we don't is because the reason why that's a problem is because, at least the applications I've seen in a marketing sense, it's usually a product-based SWOT. These are inductive, right? We have the product, we have the market. Now we're inducing the relevance. Now we're saying, okay, now that we know what the product is, now that we know what the market is, what are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? That's too late down the line before we can tell. If you're asking that once you have the product, what are you doing making that product? Who designed that? Who wasn't asking those questions earlier in that phase? And so one of the things that you see on that is something like the example up on the screen. Our strength is our superior product, and our weakness is that we cost more. It's got to be one of those. How can it be both of those? If it's not a superior, if it's a product, it justifies a higher market price. If it doesn't justify the higher market price, it's not the superior product. We can't our strength and our weaknesses do not exist independent of each other. They do not exist. SWOT are separated purely because of organizable issues. But the story should be a single, cohesive story. So when we induce our strengths, when we say, okay, here's where we are, and here's our situation, what are our strengths? We're telling the story as though we don't have control of our situation. We're telling the story as though we can't change our business or we can't change our industry. We're in control of all of that. We're in control of the creation and the destruction. We're in control of how much we make and how much we sell them for. We have access to both supply and demand side of our equations. We don't get to inductively decide anything. Not at the strategic level. It's on us to deduce the best options. And so a strategic SWOT analysis is deductive. How do we understand a predictive analysis from our strengths? How can we predict which of our capabilities is going to be most competitively relevant in the future, so that we can direct our investment strategies towards enhancing our advantages? It's about telling us how to direct our business. It's about telling us what opportunities are worth pursuing. And so the opportunities and threats that exist in a strategic SWOT analysis, they aren't market opportunities or market threats. They're all market opportunities, right? The market is nothing but opportunity. It's what I don't know how else we can talk about markets as an opportunity to grow with it, an opportunity to decline less with it, an opportunity to fail less aggressively than our rivals. It's always framed positivistically. And so the idea of our opportunities and threats, our strengths and our weaknesses, are not induced from our internal capabilities. They're 100% deduced from how our capabilities fit our strategic orientation, fit our position. We cannot separate those two. If you do not have market gaps relevant to your strengths, then it's not a real opportunity. If you see a threat that is not relevant to your strategy, it's not a threat. If the threat is we're not going to be able to get people to buy enough of our product, that's not a threat. If anything, it's a really poorly worded opportunity to get greater market share. But it's not a threat. The threat is that your rivals have better products. The threat is that the market doesn't actually exist. The threat needs to be articulated at a level, in a way that allows us to come up with an outcome, with a conclusion. And that conclusion should be the same conclusion from the entire analysis. We shouldn't have strength conclusions and weakness conclusions and opportunity, because those are tied all together. So the interpreting your SWOT analysis is, again, a capability that is not intuitive. I would recommend rethinking the way that we do SWOT analyses in a couple of ways. One, I would recommend that we separate the boundaries. So many times your SWOT analysis is defined as a SWOT matrix, as like a 2x2 strength, weakness, opportunity, threat. I think that implies a degree of separation, a degree of cognitive distinction between these categories that I don't see. I personally do not see how these are that separate of categories. And so instead of making those really strict boundaries, if we loosen up the boundaries, then we can start to look at strengths as capabilities. Your actual strengths of your SWOT analysis is the ability that you have to outperform your rivals, right? That gives us at least a tie. It's not perfect and it's not universal. And if we want to come up with of hypotheticals of why that wouldn't work, they abound. And yes, that is, again, loose logics. There are loose logics to strategy. And if anything, I'm saying we need looser logics with our SWOT. I'm not saying stricter. I'm saying we need to look at strength as a way of understanding capabilities, not just benefits, not just assets, not just value, but capabilities for the future. So let's think about that in a little bit, and let's think about testing the limits of what we think of as a resource strength. So let's think. So I don't know if I went right into SWOT and didn't even talk about your RIO analysis. Luckily, that one's a lot easier. So your RIO analysis is essentially a way of just determining whether or not a resource is worth talking about more. And so really we build strategy around RIO assets, right? They need to be valuable. They need to be rare. They need to be inimitable. They need to be organizable, right? All of those things are relative, you'll notice, just like strength. Just like strength is a relative term. Strong compared to what? Strong where? So are all those. Valuable, rare, inimitable, organizable. Those are relative to the industry. It needs to be valuable to the market. It needs to be valuable to your goals, not just to you, not just to your personal value of it, but to your strategic goals. I mean, personal value is important for a lot of things too. I'm not saying don't do things that you personally find valuable. Just don't call them a strategy. Don't build a strategy around it. Any questions on Brio? Because now I'm going to start talking about it. I think if we understand strengths, then Brio becomes sort of a natural way of just double checking that. So if we have a real asset that is unrelated, an asset that is valuable in the industry, it's rare in the industry, it's inimitable and organizable, you have an asset, you have a real asset, but it's unrelated to your current core competencies. Is that a resource strength that you should leverage in your strategy towards a competitive advantage? What do you think? Right? It's not. There's so many situations where the answer could be different, but in general, not really. If it is, then we need. If you have an incredibly valuable asset that isn't related to how you're currently accomplishing your goals, then you need to figure out a way to use it, or you need to figure out a way not to, right? Or you need to figure out a way to spin it off, sell it off as IP. Is it part of your main goal, or is it a subsidiary? Did you just become a business unit? Is this the way how you're going to pivot into the future? I don't know. But the point is, a valuable asset that's not strategically relevant is no longer a strategically valuable asset. The point is, capabilities aren't rare. Assets aren't rare. Ideas aren't rare. Ideas are a dime a dozen. We can go into any undergraduate entrepreneurship class and find a dozen perfectly legitimate, fine business ideas that would probably be fine. That would probably perform well. Right? The ideas aren't hard. It's finding the way to do them. It's finding the way to articulate them. It's finding the way to pursue them relative to other ideas. And know that that's the best source of your time. Not just a good source of your time, but better than the normal, better than average, a solid source of your time. And so finding what to do with assets that are valuable but aren't relevant is important. Think about that in your SWOT analysis, or in your CAPSIP. There was already first year some capacity sales in the industry. How interesting. Obviously, it's not about obviously the signal there is not that they're not in a growth orientation. Every company's in a growth orientation. But I'm pretty sure if you were a rival and you saw one company selling off capacity in the high-end segment and building it in the low-end segment, pretty sure we don't need to guess too far what their orientation is doing. It's not that it's not valuable, it just wasn't relevant to them, and so they sold it for funds. Perfectly reasonable thing to do. In another situation, that same company would find their high-end capacity more valuable than their low-end capacity. But in this situation, they didn't. That's just about the nature of how we understand capabilities and opportunity, and that we don't all interpret opportunity in the same way. If we did, you all would have been equal, you still would have been clones of each other. If we all understood opportunity in the same way, you still would have made the same CAPSIM decisions, but you didn't. 1 year in, and there's clusters going on. What about a strategically valuable, rare, and organizable asset that you can easily imitate? Is that a core competence? Is that a resource strength? Why not? Because if it's easy to imitate, your rivals can imitate it. And so, is it really what we want to? Is it really a competence that we want to hinge our overall strategy on? Well, what if you're actually in an industry with very high switching costs? What if you actually don't have a huge risk of? So even if your rivals do imitate it, your customers would have to expend a lot of money to switch. And all of a sudden, well, maybe, right? That was one of Porter's 5 forces. Maybe, all of a sudden, industry dynamics change this. What if there's a very high risk of substitutes? all of a sudden doesn't seem so bad, does it? All of a sudden, inimitable might not be the biggest threat out there. All of a sudden, there's probably a bigger fish in your scope. That's not a fish. But, you know, there's bigger issues. So the idea here is that the way that we want to understand these capabilities needs to be just as dynamic as the capabilities themselves. If we understand why dynamic capabilities are important, which we do, because I think it's fairly clear, we see the firms that are able to survive. We see that dynamic capabilities as consumers, as business students, as people living in this world, we see that dynamic capabilities lead to competitive strengths. But the way that we evaluate those capabilities needs to remain contextual and dynamic as well. And the Rio and SWOT analysis tell us that. And when we start thinking the SWOT analysis tells us something very, very specific, or it starts telling us if we need to get the same outcome every time, then we start categorizing and simplifying and then generalizing. And generalizing doesn't actually help us. Not that much. Not in terms of prediction. Not in terms of coming up with a new strategy. It doesn't. So one thing that you might be thinking, because it's something that it's hard to ignore now that we're wrapping up this first section, is that a lot of the themes of these discussions have been, it's not actually super precise. A lot of the themes of this discussion it's more about being on your toes than it is about being really, really grounded. Right? Being really, really grounded only helps you until the ground starts shaking. And so the idea of our strategy being able to radically shift, right, being able to change, is the idea that that's what we're looking for goes away very quickly as soon as you move into it. Right? The idea that we should have a very precise strategy, a very precise plan. You're hopefully seeing that in your capstone. I had conversations with all of you. There was some precise planning going on. There was some good use of Excel. There was some good use of ways of thinking about this simulation as an 8-year simulation, and that's good. That's a good way to think about it. I guarantee you that is not time wasted. But the game doesn't look like the way you thought it did after just 1 year. So all of the value of that thought needs to be restructured. There's still value there. It doesn't mean that the plans don't work. It means that we need to be able to pivot those capabilities to reach today's opportunities. We know that they're similar. We know that it's not that different. Especially in the simulation, you can't come and be outmoded. No one's going to come and take over your rivals. But we do want to make sure that we understand that we rely on loose models, and that actually every model we've talked about so far has been loose. Every model we've talked about has been categorical, hasn't been super precise. And that should hopefully start giving you an idea of how organizations are run, how complex organizations are run at the executive level, especially if you've not had a lot of experience with executive decision making. The notion that those models are loose and these models are how we base a lot of our decisions should tell you that at the executive level, corporate strategy is loosely structured, and it is. And if you've not read corporate strategy plans or you've not engaged in corporate strategy analyses, that's something I would recommend that maybe after the exam. I'd spend this week preparing for the exam, but maybe after that, take a look at some corporate reports. Take a look at the strategies that get made in your organization at the highest level, and see how loose they are. See how less precise they are than the strategies that are at your at a functional level. I'm assuming you're a functional manager. That's a pure assumption. I don't actually know. I'm talking generally. But let's assume you're a functional manager. Look at your executive plans and see the differences. Our functions should be structured precisely. Our strategy shouldn't. And it's weird because we need to communicate between them too much. One of the reasons that we don't is because the ideologies that we want in strategy don't work. Right? We want them. We want the idea that strategy is successful in this one way, and we wish that we had that. And when you read, some of the books, when you read, Jack Welch's or some of the classic strategy books, right? The idea is presented as though there was one way that General Electric was going to be successful, and Welch found it. And I just don't think that's true. I just cannot imagine a situation where that's actually the case that happened. Where the path dependence that occurred was ideological, was linear, was focused on a very clear, known objective from the start. Maybe that happens at some point, but it's never happened in any situation where I've seen or that I've studied. And so the idea that your strategy needs to hold up to competition means that we don't have room for really strict rules. And in fact, those strategies that outcompete others aren't the ones that fit into these models precisely. I'm not saying that if you use these models more precisely, you're going to outcompete your rivals, because you won't. In fact, finding out where you can break these rules, finding out where you can all of a sudden change the fact of whether or not it's inimitable is actually relevant or not, shows that you have a better understanding of that context. Shows that actually the assumptions that were made up until now are shaky and no longer working, and the industry's changing. Right? Following static models of competition doesn't help us. Following rules that are no longer relevant doesn't help us. There was that when you needed a 7 o'clock taxi cab from the hotel, you had to freaking tell them the night before and show up like within a half-hour time frame and maybe get a taxi cab at the front of the hotel at 6 in the morning. Now, the rules changed. Now you go on Uber and the rules have changed. The rule was that the rule was that we have to go into, the rule was that we have to have in-person classes to have a master's. And we have to change that as things come up. The rule was that you had to be at home at a certain time to watch television. Now, time is meaningless and no one has time for television. The rules change. The way that we understand norms, the way that we understand success changes. That's not natural. That's not something that just happens in the market. And one day we woke up and Uber existed. That took someone breaking that rule. It took someone seeing an opportunity, and that's something we see in our organizations. The organizations that break the rules succeed more than the organizations that follow them to the grave. Yes. The rule changed. The rules change all the time, and the people in front of those rules changes, and that's true. That is true. That is weird. If we took the business processes and business norms of today and applied them to 10 years ago, to 20 years ago, it would look weird. It's not normal, and it wouldn't be successful. What worked today wouldn't have worked. And so the rules do change. We do get into crisis changes. It is weird, right? I get my groceries delivered on my doorstep from Amazon. It's weird, but I do. I wouldn't have thought that. But the rules changed. What success was changed. What did it take for me to afford to decide that Whole Foods was worth the price? Well, free delivery. That was it. Free delivery in the pandemic. So, the rules change. Value changes. Strategy changes. The success comes when we find those opportunities and pursue them, not when we come up with great plans and follow them. How are we doing? Okay, let's take a step back. It's got a little dense, and I got a little passionate about it. It's going a little longer than I intended. So let's make sure that this is relevant to us, both for the exam and for the capstone. Let's start with the capstone. So some things about the industry that we can follow along from the same internal analysis. If you're doing an internal analysis for your second round decisions, you should be doing some type of, there's some things that you're going to know. First, the selling, general, and administrative costs for the industry were way higher than they were for the practice round. More so than anything else that impacted performance. It was because SGA was up really high. The industry had much better marketing and R&D compared to the practice rounds. I would say that's a good thing. That makes us more competitive. That makes the industry more dynamic. But what that does do is it changes what success looks like. In the practice rounds, because it was relatively rare for a good marketing strategy, the teams that did have a good marketing strategy had a real advantage. Isn't that interesting? Now that it's not rare, it's no longer an advantage. We've changed what an advantage looks like. And if we can change it over just 1 week how much do you think we're going to change it as we learn more about this? And so what was an advantage in the early parts of the game became a norm, became a necessity, became a benchmark. Now, you can't do anything if you don't have a good marketing strategy. Now you can't compete at all if you don't have that high R&D. Now, all of a sudden, if we think of high R&D leading to an advantage over rivals, the R&D spending in this industry was huge. Is it still leading to an advantage if everyone's perfectly placed in their segments? Yes. I mean, but does that mean you can't do it anymore? No. We just drove the margins down. That's competition. We're driving the margins down. We're being less efficient because there's 6 of us than we would be if we were a monopoly. We're driving down the economic value potential of our industry, and it's good. It's good for the industry. It's good for the competition, and it gives us an actual playing field to see who can compete. One of my worst fears when I wake up, when I go for the first round of this competition, is I wake up Monday morning, and my worst fear is that one team is doing great and the other teams are doing poorly. That would be the worst case because there's no way to pick. Because it's not like you can tell that team, oh, you did too good. No, they did fine. They did what they were supposed to do. But you can build an advantage quickly. Now, no team's doing phenomenally, and the teams that are doing the best don't have a runaway lead. That's a better, more competitive position to be in. And it puts us at a higher strain for making sure that we do well. It gets a higher pressure on the top performers, and it gives low performers more power. That sounds weird, but a more competitive industry means that low performers have a greater capacity to shift the market. And that's a perfectly legitimate move, right? That's a perfectly way of thinking about that, right? Is playing the game as a competitive game, right? Should you stop? Should you keep prioritizing R&D? Probably. It's hard to say it's not going to work. But what if a bunch of people start deprioritizing R&D? What if all of a sudden the industry changes again and industry norms change again? You probably don't want to let your baskets get that overfilled with eggs. And so the way that we understand advantage is relative. The way that we understand capabilities is relative. We talked about that in our internal resource analysis. You're seeing that firsthand in the CAPSIM. You can see who the leaders are. You can see what the cost differences are. Right? And so by looking at your internal capabilities, we can see what an advantage is easily in this simulation, and I hope you do. Think about resource strengths. Use the CAPSIM as a backdrop. Talk about it with me if it's having trouble, because if we can see it how it works in this closed system, we're a step closer to seeing how we can start finding this information and finding these openings outside of the closed system, our open competitive systems. Questions on the CAPSIM or internal analyses in general? So, let's wrap up the first section of this class and then talk about the first exam. Hopefully, so you have had now a month and a half of strategy classes taught by an analyst, taught by somebody who lives at the industry level. That's where my fascination is. That's where my interests lie. Where most of my work is done. And so you've been getting a bit of a biased perspective. I personally think it's a better one, but I'm biased. That's why. I think that you can be taught somebody who's had 50 years of strategy experience managing Delta, which we have faculty members with great strategy experience that have retired and became professors. That's a normal thing to do. It's nice, but in terms of seeing how we can understand the dynamic nature of industry and opportunity, what we're talking about more in this class than how to be a good manager, which I'm not the person you should talk to, is how to make informed decisions, is how to ask better questions, and how to find sources of data that allow us to answer questions that we otherwise wouldn't be able to answer, and that our competitors might not be able to answer. That's where the value of industry analysis comes in. That's where the value of strategy comes in. But strategy is not analytical, it's organizational. The focus on analysis is because an analyst hammer is going to see problems as analyst nails. And two, because this is where value can be added to this current field of strategic management. This is where there are gaps and opportunities. This is where if you want to be a strategist today, this is where you're going to be that. This is because analysts in measurement are so different that they have a 30-year-old running their research centers at universities. Because the way that we understand data is different. The way that we understand strategic analysis has changed faster than the old guard has kept up. And we are in a turbulent state of strategic analysis. That turbulence is opportunity. If we see it in the industry analysis, that dynamism, that shift, all of a sudden, that's the risk of substitutes. And the substitute is, instead of charisma driving your leadership, what if it's an analytics? The trick is, what if instead of teaching CEOs to get people to like them, we teach them how to manage and delegate an aggressive, data-driven system of asking and answering good questions. Analysis has not kept up with changing industry norms. Just tell by the way your textbook talks about it. Look at how outdated this textbook is for being 2 years old. It's crazy. Industry responses to this analyst gap that we, graduate students, people changing their careers, are going to be the ones that are able to have access to, because now we have access to more data than we have ever before, and we have no idea how to use it. Your organizations, unless you're in one of the rare exceptions, doesn't know how to use it. They need help. They need help from every level. They don't need help from just IS. They don't need help from just data science. They don't need help from just their engineers. They need help from strategically minded managers that know how to use information in a way to answer questions that we're asking for her. Because we do have access to that. There is a massive timeline for data-driven decision-making. We've been talking about big data driving business decisions for a decade now. And in some industries, if we look at heavy manufacturing, it's done it. If we look at, if you want to manufacture, if you want to look at the real one that the caps, if you want to look at sensor manufacturing, you'd have to do semiconductor manufacturing where you get better data from, because it's so international. And international firms are better at reporting data. Then we can actually see that. Right now, there is that timeline. The companies, the managers, the individuals that are in the front of that tap into that data-driven processes, that can start asking these questions in ways that are actually meaningful. As soon the companies, the managers that are able to go, they're able to shift from, look at all this data we have, to look at all this data we're using. Those are going to be the ones that are successful. Those are what organizations are investing towards. Those are what we're doing. That's what we're building at our center to service that. That's what your employers are going to be needing. And that's what you're doing as a strategist. So that's why we're talking so much on this analyst side, because in terms of competitive relevance, I honestly think this is more relevant than you learning how to do good mergers and acquisitions, because the acquisition market is crazy right now. It's not exactly sure that that's where we're heading down. We're moving from our world is changing. We're going from a highly public economy to a highly privatized economy, and it's weird. We haven't had a successful IPO in like 3 years. Isn't that weird? Isn't it weird? We consider IPO success has changed so much just in the last several years. Seems like there's opportunity. Seems like there's turbulence. Seems like there's dramatic shifts happening. And the companies and the individuals that are able to take advantage of that, they're able to model and see the situation happening before them and predict how to take advantage of it, just like it has in every other time of market turbulence, are going to be the ones that are successful. That takes strategy. So yes, we are wrapping up the analyst side of this class. Yes, as an analyst, I'm a little sad about that. I want us to keep the analytical mindset moving forward. I'm just trying to stop me, but I'd like to keep that as we're talking about this, as we're talking about mergers and acquisitions and diversification and integration. Remember that these are tactics for pursuing opportunities. Those opportunities exist because we studied them better. The opportunities are there because we know them better. We know our capabilities better. Not because we know how to form alliances better. Not because we know how to acquire companies better. Those are the tactics. Those are the tools. We got to analysis is the skill. How are we feeling? Questions before we move into talking about the first exam? Okay. So, moving on. and ever so slightly later than intended. Let's talk about the first exam. That is going to be next week. You are welcome to take it in class. You're welcome to take it out of class. You are going to need a laptop, and you're going to need to have access to D2L. You're going to be on the Respondus lockdown browser. If you go on to D2L right now, you should see a sample lockdown browser exam that has the same settings. So if you can use that one, you'll be able to use exam 1. The questions on there are drawn from both from the whole pool of questions that I've come up for the entire class, but you can use those as sort of sample questions too, but some of them are for the final exam. So if some of them seem out there, don't worry about it. In this exam, there's going, so during regular class time, there's going to be 50 multiple choice questions. So as is hopefully, and it's going to cover chapters 1 through 5, what I broadly call the competitive context of strategy, the analysis of strategy, not the decisions themselves. I have intentionally kept the exam focused in that way because that's how our class has been focused, that's how our discussion is focused. The textbook blurs it a little bit, but in here we're going to keep it exam 1's analysis, exam 2's application. So the questions are going to be focused on identifying relevant strategic information, being able to identify strategic orientation, and the context. Now remember, we didn't actually talk about critically understanding strategic orientation. That's actually our very next chapter for our second exam. So you don't need to understand, you don't need to prescribe strategic orientation. You just need to be able to identify it. If I give you a context, if I give you a scenario, and there's relevant information in the question, you should be able to identify who the cost leader is, who the price leaders are, what the types of advantages that we're getting, right? And it's a multiple choice format, so it's not going to be very complicated. Across, I'm going to see if I can record this now that I'm here again. I'm not optimistic. The structure of questions there's 3 different tiers of questions that are going to be asked. And these are tiers based off of, not really difficulty, but 50% of the questions are going to be basic questions. They're going to be content questions. Do you know what this is? Do you know how to define, I'm going to say competitive advantage, it's a little broad, but yeah, sure. Well, how do we know among this list, what's a competitive advantage? What's path dependent? What does it mean when we say path dependence? Very basic. Half the questions are not meant to kill you. I promise you. Half these questions, and they're questions that students get right by design. These are questions that are going to let us know where some big issues are if we have them. But no, most of these questions are intended for you to know. So the way to prepare for those questions is to make sure that there's been no open up that book. If there's bolded terms, if there's topics that came up a bunch, you have a basic understanding of it. If they didn't come up in our discussion, they didn't come up in our slides, then they're probably not going to follow through to the tier 2 or tier 3 questions, but they can still show up. Tier 2 questions are application questions. These take those basic concepts and ask you to apply them usually in an isolated, linear way. Basic application. Can we not only know what cost leadership is, but can we identify when it's most relevant? Do we know which one of those capstone, I'm not going to use capstone on the exam, but just for us, do we know from those capstone segments which ones are going to respond more aggressively, which customer segments are going to respond more aggressively to price fluctuations than others? We do know that. So we'll know what a price competition is more effective in some segments than others. Basic application. That's it. The example of the basic application question would be, which one of these market segments would a cost leadership strategy likely lead to the most value creation? And then I would tell you what the price sensitivities are or whatever. But we know that. Tier 3 questions are advanced application questions. There's only 5 of these on the exam, but they, instead of having a linear, here's something, apply it, they actually are going to draw from multiple sources. So they're going to say, okay, if you understand both internal analysis and external analysis, let's talk about them in a synthesized way. They're going to be questions that are drawn from multiple chapters and applied in a way, probably from our discussion, but even then, not necessarily explicitly ever discussed. They're going to be advanced in a way beyond what the textbook presents them as an integrated logic. They're going to talk about goals and opportunities. Which one of these opportunities is most relevant in this strategic mission? Right? We're going to be able to apply understanding the strategy beyond individual measures of performance. And so the tier 3 questions, of which there's only 5, are going to be advanced application questions, and they're going to look like strategy questions that you would get on a strategy assessment. Some of them are going to be questions that I got directly from advanced strategy assessments. So they're going to be, they're the ways that we look at taking these tools and pushing them further. But there's only 5 of them, and they're all worth the same amount of points. But those are fun ones. Questions on the nature of the exam. Okay, let's talk about the content of the exam. Content of the exam. So, there's a handful of topics that we're going to be talking about over and over and over in the exam. They're just going to come up in different ways. The good news is, if you're starting to see the themes and the trends across these lectures, if these lectures are starting to sound repetitive, good. They should, because we're looking at once we start realizing that we're looking at the same phenomenon, the same logics in different lenses, the faster we're growing, right? So understanding competitive logics, not just definitions, not just rules, but do we know what it means to be competitive? Do we know what it means to have a resource strength? Do we know what it means to have a dynamic capability? What does it mean to be competitive? It's relative, and it's both internal and external. It's both mission-driven and industry-relevant. It's also where we're going to look at sort of making sure that we understand the different natures of strategy, as we talked about, business strategy versus corporate strategy. Do we know when we're talking about markets versus when we're talking about industries? Right? They're both relevant. You can't separate the two. You can't say, oh, today we're just talking about industry-relevant strategy. No, if it's not business relevant, then it's not industry relevant. It needs to be both. That's how we grow our industries, is by being better businesses. It has to be both. Do we know the differences in the semantics arguments? Do we know what it means when we, so the ones I have there are ones that we have not talked about in great specificity. What's an ally versus a subsidiary versus a business unit? Right? That's something your book talked about. I figured that's something that we didn't spend too much time on, but this is an exam review, and it's on that, so you should know that it's probably going to show up on at least a couple of those easy questions, because that's an easy thing to ask about. And it's important that you don't know, right? It's important to know that the difference between an ally and a subsidiary and a business unit, those are very different things. We're going to talk about interpreting strategic leadership. So more so than identifying it or using, I'm not going to talk too much about leadership traits. I can't imagine I'm going to talk any about leadership traits. I don't really look at leadership traits in the book, but I am going to talk about the nature of strategic leadership as a strategic tool. So what makes leadership strategic leadership? That's when it's organizationally driven, right? It's when we're focused on goal-oriented, instrumental leadership, not personality-driven, not trait-driven, not individually driven, organizationally driven leadership. Okay? Looking at the types of strategies that are planned versus as they emerge in organizations, and how we drive and evaluate and measure our goals through understanding our mission and vision and values. And again, the heterogeneity of our strategy, what makes strategy different between firm A and firm B, is only those 3 things: goals, resources, and governance. That's it. And so we need to be able to talk about goals, and that's strategic leadership and governance, although we're not really talking about governance in this class too much. And then making sure we can understand the resources, the other part. Resources, understanding competitive analyses, understanding the basics of the resource-based view, those basic assumptions. And again, understanding the basic assumptions is understanding the resource-based view. If you don't know the assumptions of resource heterogeneity and resource immobility, then it's not really a resource-based view. Then there's no value in studying and measuring organizations as bundles of resources, because the resources are not heterogeneous to each other. They're the same resources across organizations. Understanding how we interpret performance differently between different types of returns. When is return on investment more relevant than return on equity, than return on revenues? They're all relevant, they're all important. None of the questions is going to say which one of these isn't important, but certainly they're used to answer different questions. When you're in the CAP setting, your returns are going to look different based off of your investment orientation. Your revenues are going to look different. Your balance sheets are going to look different from year 1 to year 8. I guarantee you. And finally, focusing on your understanding of our competitive advantage, being able to define industry as through functions of rivalry, define industry as a competitive context inherently and necessarily, understanding how competition evolves as industries mature, understanding the shift between perfect competition to monopolistic competition to oligarchic competition to monopolistic competition. And knowing that what success looks like changes. Knowing that when we're in the middle of those changes, that the industry dynamics are going to be fundamentally different. Knowing that mergers and acquisitions is, when you have an industry with a high level of mergers and acquisitions, at the macro level, what we mean is we have an industry that's going through consolidation. Industry is consolidating into fewer competitors. They're growing that way. That could be a number of things, right? That would be a great example of a tier 3 question, is when we look at how competitive advantages change between different industry structures, and how high levels of industry consolidation in one year might actually lead to a deficient resource capabilities in the next year because there's fewer rivals tailored to your competitive investments. We can start to see these follow-throughs. We can start to see, once we start thinking about the next step, right? If thinking strategically means we're thinking about the next step, it's natural and intuitive to keep following those steps further. And that's what we're going to be looking at. So those are the main, as I was sort of coming up with some questions and reviewing previous exams and thinking about the exam, those are the ones that came up. Those are what I was focusing on this semester. That feels like that's a fair overview of what we've talked about in discussion. And so hopefully none of those are brand new to you. Right? Or if they are, they're brand new to you, that they're really simple things that I'm just sort of giving you. We didn't talk too much about what a subsidiary is. But since this is a strategy class, a governance class, and we do talk about portfolios, we should know the difference. Feeling good? Questions on content? Okay, so now we've talked about the nature of it, and we've talked about the content of it. Let's talk about the feel of it. As we're taking this strategy exam, it's important to remember, again, hopefully everything seems repetitive. Hopefully you're starting to see that we're actually saying the same thing over and over and over and over. That's what's happening. And it's because we know that process. It's because we know the goal. It's because even though strategy is constantly changing and constantly dynamic, we're able to structure it within boundaries that allow us to create sort of an understanding of it that is generalizing. We do know what the system looks like. We do know what the strategic management process looks like. We know that it's actually a cycle, but we know that that analysis, formulation, implementation approach, that AFI model, gives us the chance to understand the strategy is dynamic and constantly being changed. That it's not about having a plan, it's about developing plans over and over and over. It's not even about following plans. It's about thinking through plans more than it is following them. We even already know the answers. We have the same words for them: competitive advantage, resource strength, dynamic capabilities. Yeah, those all mean different things at different levels of analysis. But in terms of your big picture strategy, they're all the same. They're nested phenomena. Your competitive advantage is an advantage at the industry level. If your competitive advantage is unrelated from your resource strengths, you did a really bad analysis. We defined something wrong. That is a definitional necessity, not a contextual necessity. Your dynamic capabilities are reinforced through your strengths, are reinforced through your advantages. Even already know the context. We know that industry competition drives this decision. I'm not going to ask you questions about nonprofits. I'm not going to ask you questions about social organizations. The logic of this class is competition. That's not the only context that this information is relevant in. This information is relevant if you work in nonprofits. This information is relevant for social organizations. This information is relevant for a number of businesses in a number of settings. But in this exam, it's a corporate strategy exam, so we're going to talk about it from competition. We know, and we're going to talk about it in terms of market opportunity. When we talk about external evaluation of events, it's going to be in terms of opportunities and threats, because that's what's relevant to our strategic decision making. Hopefully, we're starting to see that as we start to look at, the first question we asked, which is what is strategy? We're hopefully starting to see that strategy can be, in addition to a bunch of plans, it can provide a structure, a template for decision making, a template for understanding what success looks like. And so, what that means is when we pursue goals that we're good at pursuing, we then invest our returns into those capabilities to make them better. It's a cyclical process. It's a feedback loop, right? We're reinforcing these capabilities. And so if you're a cost leader, you need to leverage your capabilities towards those opportunities tied to advantages in your cost leadership to be successful. Because resources are finite and we don't get to be everything. We just don't, especially not at, I don't think ever, but especially not at the business level. Maybe a conglomerate can be everything. They certainly keep trying, but businesses can't. So, if you can't price your price lower because your costs are too high, you don't have that much of an advantage. Your investment strategy needs to be different. You need to leverage their investment towards it. What does that look like in the cap set? What's the biggest investment you can leverage towards cost leadership in the cap set? Probably automation to high volume segments. If you are a cost leader and you're not leveraging your investment towards automation, you're probably not going to get to stay cost leader, because the costs of your rivals are going to go down at a faster rate than you. If you're a quality differentiator, but your products aren't able to outperform your rivals' products in ways that justify their increased pricing, then you're not leading, then you're not generating enough value to justify your business. Then you're not a business yet. You don't have that value proposition yet. Right? We need both of those. We need both our profit and our value propositions in order to have a valuable product in a segment. And so your strategy is not meant to just give you your goals of what we're doing. It's not meant just to give you that structure of what success looks like. It tells us what the means we should be leveraging should be, because the ends we're achieving need to be instrumental towards those. Mean instrumentality, if you remember from last week. So hopefully that gives you some mind, because we do have a lot of stuff that we go over in this class, but it's most of it is the same stuff, just looking at it from a different angle, looking at it as an industry member, looking at it as an organizational member, looking at it as a marketing person, as an R&D person, as an operations person, but it's the same phenomenon. So let's just make sure that we're all on the same page with that. Try some basic word association. Let's give off an expression. You let me know what it sounds like we're talking about. A firm that is able to leverage its resources to achieve superior performance among key measures relative to rival firms in the same industry can be said to have a, say it a little bit loud, a competitive advantage. Yeah, that's it. That's what that is. That's a competitive advantage. That's how we define competitive advantage. Okay, let's try again. A firm that is competing on the basis of cost leadership and leverages their operational capabilities to lead industry in minimizing product costs relative to rivals can be said to have a. So they're pursuing cost leadership, but what does that? But because they're succeeding at it, what do they have? It's a competitive advantage again. It's the same question. It's the exact same question given with different context. There's only so many ways that we're asking these questions. And so the way that we, sorry, I just saw that message right now, and unfortunately I want to keep going, but I will try my best. So I will be here. I'm going to end this off by saying that I am going to be available this week for exam review at the team level, individual level as you need, but we'll wrap up to that. Sorry again for the not being able to record. That is an unfortunate part of this, but luckily we have most of the class in attendance, so hopefully there's good note taking, and the folks that aren't here, hopefully there's some teammate work going on. Okay. So the way that we understand competitive advantage we need to make sure that we can understand it so that we can recognize it generally and specifically. Okay, what about this one? established firm has had a rough couple of years, has a plan for a strong comeback, but is operating with returns below the industry average despite promising future opportunities. This firm can be said to have a competitive disadvantage. That's it. It's a competitive disadvantage, not because they don't have the potential to succeed in the future, not because they don't have the opportunity to be successful in the future, but because at this point, they are not able to advantageously leverage their capabilities in market-relevant ways. Because at this point, they're performing below industry averages, regardless of these plans. And so the idea of an advantage or disadvantage, the idea of how we recognize these same phenomena in different ways needs to be sort of ordered in this way. And I know I use competitive advantage as the only example. We talked about it probably more than anything else. But the same way that we can sort of understand this, so this is sort of an example of not really a tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 questions. The tier 3 question is a little too much of a tier 2 question. But this gives you an idea of what that is. A tier 1 question, that's just the definition of competitive advantage. A tier 2 question is looking at that in an applied way. That's what an applied version of the competitive advantage is. A cost leadership leverages operational capabilities. Right? And then the just shifting up the terms, making sure that we can see the differences as well. And to know that those disadvantages, even though we haven't talked a lot about competitive disadvantages, they exist as an outcome of not having a competitive advantage. They don't exist as an inherent flaw. They don't exist as something that you can't fix. Look at the cap sim. If you're analyzing your cap sim industry and you're counting out any of these 6 teams, you are looking at it incorrectly. We have 6 competitive firms in this industry, and that's awesome, right? Does that mean that some of them don't have competitive disadvantages? No, I bet all of them do if we look close enough. But understanding how we frame that is making sure that we understand. Let's talk a little bit about the theory that's driving some of these questions, and then we'll wrap it up and open it up for students' questions and teamwork for the rest of the time. So, making sure that we're comfortable with some of the theory. I admittedly sort of skim over it, and I want to make sure that we are finding that when we make these distinctions, that we're all on the same page. So I skim the corporate and business level. I switch those perspectives all the time. I try to use the right terms, right? I try to keep things market focused when I'm doing business and industry focused when we're doing corporate, but we don't make these decisions in isolation of each other. And so the idea of business versus corporate strategy is more an issue not of the type of strategy that we perform, but the level of analysis that we're interpreting. And so the boundaries that differentiate corporate and business levels analysis are not super strict, but you're taking a multiple choice exam. And so the way that I will be illustrating these differences is going to be obvious, is going to be clear. When I'm trying to, knowing that these aren't always very different, the way that I use theory in the exam is not to remove it. There's still theory in this exam. I'm still proud of this exam. It's an actual strategy exam for a master's level strategy course. But I am going to try my best to use language that solidifies sort of where we're talking about. So I'm going to explicitly try to make sure that we understand, especially looking at corporate and business level strategy, that we can separate out those questions so that you know when we're talking about internal operations and value chains, I'm going to be specifically saying those in the questions or in the answers, and so that you can frame those appropriately. And I'm specifically going through the questions to remove confusing parts of answers that could be relevant at the corporate level of its business strategy question and vice versa. So the theory is confusing. The questions on the exam are going to be excessively straightforward to avoid that. So there should not be there should not be much confusion there. If there is, you're more than welcome to answer it. So one thing I'll say for next week, even when you're taking it outside of the classroom, log into Teams on your phone and have that chat box open. Feel free to ask me chat questions if you'd like. But you hopefully shouldn't need them. because I'm really trying to differentiate these very well. Similar when we talk about strategic position and business model. So I'm not going to business model too much on the exam because we're talking about industry level strategy a lot. But the market level strategy, the business model, is still where we're going to understand value creation and value generation. We can't separate the market from value generation. And so where business modeling is still going to come up is when we're shifting away from an industry focus of performance and into a market focus of performance. And that's something we've not talked about a huge amount. So it's not going to be a huge presence on the exam, but one, it should be on the exam a little. Two, we should talk about it. So let's make sure that we're on the same page. I think because it's not too tough. But when we talk about your business model, really there's two parts of it. There's any business model only has two sentences. It needs to have two sentences, and everything else builds from those. Your profit proposition and your value proposition. What about your business is going to be profitable? How is your functions as a business going to generate more returns than costs? Right? If you don't have that, you don't have a business. And a value proposition. What about your business or your product adds value to the market? How are your customers going to enjoy your product? If you don't have a value proposition and you don't have a profit proposition, then you don't have a business. So what happens if you have a profit proposition but not a value proposition? If you say, I know how I'm going to make a bunch of money in this industry, I'm going to sell PowerPoint clickers that I bought for $15 for $10,000. That's a profit proposition if I ever heard one. There's a lot of profit off these PowerPoint clickers, isn't it? It's not really valuable. Doesn't really add value to the market. Hard to say. It's relying on customers being tricked. Not a good business. If your business model relies on customers being dumb, it's not a good business model. Maybe it works a little bit, but it's not going to work in the long term. It just isn't. And so you need to balance your profit and value. Same with the value proposition. If you have a way of generating really high levels of market value, but you can't do so in a way that is profitable, but you can't do so in a way that costs you less, that earns you more money than it costs you. If you do so in a way where every item that you sell is at a loss, it's not a good business. It's not going to work. It's just not. Right? It's not a sustainable business. It's not accomplishing its basic goals at the market level. Your business model needs to have a market-relevant profit proposition and a market-relevant value proposition. We don't talk about those in the industry level because we talk about returns and industry performance. The assumption there is that we have good business modeling. It's an assumption. It's usually a safe assumption. But the reason why we don't talk about business models is because if you're looking at your return on investment and return on revenues at the industry level and you have a negative profit proposition, we're going to tell. We're going to be able to see it at the level because you're not going to perform very well at the industry level. And so they're nested into each other. I don't talk about your business model too much, but it is very relevant. I do want to make sure that we're on the same page because I know the book talked about it a lot. I also want to make sure that we understand that we spent a lot of time in this class talking about how we measure a competitive advantage. In the exam, the measurements are going to be geared towards the models that we talked about relative to your book. I'm not going to have any even really advanced questions that can't be tied to something in the official lectures. Anything that we talked about that was purely sort of discussion-oriented, that was sort of a spin-off, is probably not going to show, it's not going to show up on the exam. And so the way that we are going to still talk about competitive advantage measurement, but don't worry about studying a bunch of those models or extra readings that I sent you. That's essentially what I'm saying here. I know at the end of every discussion I send off extra readings. Those are cool. There's interesting looks at how we can look at contemporary applications here. I hope that if you're interested, you do review those, because those are done by contemporary people applying these in organizations in real life. And so we can see how these are applied. But in the exam, we're going to measure competitive advantage through resource strengths and RIO analysis and profit and value propositions. We're going to use the tools that the book uses to answer the question, even though we know that that can mean a lot of other things. So there is still theory in this class, or in this exam, but it's going to be simplified. Questions on that? How are we feeling on corporate and business levels of analysis, strategic positioning and business modeling, and I don't know if we've talked about competitive advantage yet, but hopefully you're good with it. Okay. So, how are we feeling on the exam? We've got about an hour before the class wraps up. I'm happy to turn this into we can do some question and answers. If you have questions about topics that you're not sure that you would like to rethink, if there's anything I can help you with, hopefully the ideas as you're sort of moving forward, as you're studying, focus on not just studying the basics. If you want to study for those tier 2 and tier 3 questions, study for weaving resource analysis into your competitive analysis. Focus on looking at opportunity recognition and industry dynamics as the same model. Industry dynamics lead to market gaps, which are opportunities. The way that we measure Porter's 5 forces and the way that we measure internal capabilities is the same font, separated by chapters, separated by levels of analysis. But if we look at the Porter's 5 forces model and we see that all those rivals are cyclically interacting with each other, what's that cyclical interaction? It's our resource analysis. We're constantly reevaluating and releveraging our resources. And so we see those effects over and over and over. So if you're starting to see that, I would recommend that. I would recommend using your captive industry as a good example of a competitive industry. This, again, a competitive industry out of the gate. Happy to see it, right? It is nice when you see uniform low profits. That was nice for me. Don't get me wrong. You want more than that. For me, it's like, oh, okay. Everyone's doing okay. I feel good about that. But you now want to look at that as an opportunity. Now you want to say, well, I can do better than that. And you should. Okay. That's what I have for you. What can I do for you before we break for exam review? And I email the team's liaison to see why I'm not recording. Questions? Help? Yes. So I guess I'm not sure what you mean. So because I don't have, so the discussion, since it's not recorded, I'll post these slides. Because usually the recording, you mean these specific slides? The narration? That wasn't there? I will upload that. Are you sure? So I have one. I have it here on my laptop. Well, so the question was, where's the narration for the internal analysis chapter? And apparently it's on my computer and not on D2L. So I will upload that very quickly. Did anyone have access to that? I see some confused looks. We'll figure that out. We'll go through. I'll make sure that we're set. Any other questions on this end in terms of class, in terms of the exam? So I'm going to break from this room, and we will be. I will be here for the remainder of the hour. Feel free to invite me into your team rooms. Feel free to ask me questions through the chat box or anything that you'd like. And we also have I do not want to forget that we still have your capstone decisions due this Sunday. So even though we have an exam on Monday, there's a lot going on. So I'm going to shut up and let you guys figure out your team-based stuff. I'll be here for help, and I'll be talking to you soon, Tiffany. Okay. Bye, everyone.